Imagine you're standing on a limestone ridge. You're in what they call the cockpit country of Jamaica, and it's, let's say, the mid-18th century. The terrain around you is just brutal. It's this karst limestone that, it looks almost like a frozen, jagged ocean. The air is thick, humid. You can smell the vegetation.
Right, you're hiding.
You're hiding, and silence is pretty much the only thing keeping you alive. And then you hear it. It just cuts through the canopy.
A sound.
A sound. It's low, it's mournful, almost guttural. Now, if you're a British soldier down in the valley, what does that sound like to you?
Well, to you, it probably just sounds like a cow horn. A stray animal, maybe a farmer somewhere in the distance, nothing to worry about.
But to you, hiding on that ridge, that's not a cow horn. That is a coded transmission.
That's the Abeng. And you're completely right. To an untrained ear, it's just noise. But in the hands of the Jamaican Maroons, that simple cow horn was, it was a highly sophisticated piece of military technology.
It's incredible.
It was basically encrypted communication. They could modify the pitch, the rhythm, to convey really specific data. We're talking troop movements, the number of muskets approaching, the direction of the wind, even the names of specific British officers.
So it's a sonic telegraph system, and it's operating right under the nose of what was then the most powerful empire on Earth.
And the British never cracked the code.
They never did.
They never did. And, that failure to decode the signal, it's the perfect metaphor for what we're really getting into today. We're looking at a narrative that spans 468 years, but we're not looking at it through the usual lens.
Right. Because the standard textbook version of Jamaican history, it's always presented as this sort of relay race of colonizers, isn't it?
It is.
Columbus hands the baton to the Spanish governor, who then kind of drops it, and the British pick it up and run with it all the way until 1962. It's a history of who planted the flag where.
Which is, at its core, a history of property. It frames the entire island as an object to be owned. But if you flip that perspective, if you decide to listen for the Abeng signal, instead of, say, the cannon fire, you see a completely different architecture.
A different story.
A totally different story. You see the history of agency. You see this continuous 468-year frequency of refusal. A refusal to be owned, a refusal to be silenced, and maybe most importantly, a refusal to be erased.
And erasure is such a key word here, because we're going back way, way further than 1492. We have to start in a time that for most people is just a blank space on the timeline. We need to talk about the silence before the storm.
The Redware silence.
It sounds like a title for a mystery novel.
It really does. But it's actually an archaeological gap that just sort of haunts the Caribbean record. We all know about the Taino, the people Columbus met. But the thing is, the Tainos weren't the first people there.
No, they were the second wave.
Exactly. Around 600 AD, a group that we now call the Redware people. And they're named after this very specific Ostenoid pottery style they left behind. They arrived in Jamaica.
So we find their pottery.
We find these distinct, vibrant red clay vessels in the archaeological strata. They had established settlements, they fished, they had a functioning society. But then, right around 900 to 1000 AD, just as the Taino culture is beginning to really ascend, the Redware people, they just vanish from the record.
And when you say vanish, you don't mean they just, packed up their pots and moved to Cuba.
Well, that's the terrifying part. It's completely ambiguous. Did they merge with the incoming Taino? Were they conquered and assimilated? Or did they just succumb to some kind of environmental pressure, a disease, a drought? We honestly don't know.
Wow.
But their disappearance, it establishes this really grim precedent for the region, the fragility of any civilization. One day you're making art, cooking food, raising children. The next century, you're shards of red clay in the dirt.
Which makes the people who came next, the Taino, all the more remarkable. Because they didn't just survive on the island, they absolutely thrived. And I think we need to be really aggressive here in dismantling the whole primitive myth.
Oh, absolutely.
The Taino zenith, let's say from about 1400 to 1494, this wasn't a bunch of people just, idling on the beach waiting for coconuts to fall. This was a highly engineered society.
It really was. If you look at the estimated population density of Jamaica in 1490, it was incredibly high for the time. You simply cannot support that many people with basic hunter-gatherer tactics. They were master agronomists. They used this system called canucos.
Okay, so let's break that down. What exactly were canucos? Because I've looked into the engineering of these, and they are fascinating. These weren't just gardens.
No, not at all. They were these large raised earthen mounds, And they were specifically designed to control drainage in a tropical climate. Get these heavy rains, right? They wash away topsoil. The mounds prevented that erosion. But they also managed moisture retention during the dry spells. It's a brilliant, low-tech solution.
It's genius.
It is. And the other part of the genius was the intercropping. They would plant cassava, yucca, which is a caloric powerhouse. It's vastly more efficient than the wheat that Europeans were eating at the time.
And they grew other things with it.
They grew maize, sweet potatoes, and beans all together in these symbiotic relationships. This food security, this surplus, is what allowed them to build a complex, stratified society.
And a society that was, you could argue, more politically stable than Europe at the same time. I mean, while Europe is just tearing itself apart with dynastic wars and religious persecution, the Taino had a governance structure that relied on the cacique.
The cacique was the chief, yes.
Yeah.
But we have to be really clear about the nature of that power. It wasn't the absolute divine right monarchy that we see in Europe. It was reciprocal.
A social contract.
It was a social contract, exactly. The cacique had to demonstrate the ability to mediate disputes, the ability to organize the harvest, and crucially, the ability to communicate with the spiritual realm. If a cacique failed the people, their power it waned.
And that spiritual connection, that brings us to the cajoba ceremony. This is fascinating. This wasn't just some kind of, recreational drug use. This was their version of a parliamentary inquiry or a high mass.
Absolutely. It was the central epistemological event of their lives. They would use this Y-shaped pipe to inhale a hallucinogenic snuff, which was made from the seeds of the cajoba on a tree. And this would induce a trance state where the cacique could consult with the zimis.
The zimis being the spiritual forces in the natural world?
Right. Ancestors, weather patterns, fertility gods, all of it. So when a hurricane was approaching, and we should remember the word hurricane is a Taino word from huracan, the cacique didn't just guess what to do. They entered the cajoba trance to consult the entity of the storm itself.
Wow.
It's a completely different way of interacting with reality. Instead of trying to dominate nature, which was the European model, you negotiate with it.
It's just so striking how deeply embedded their language still is in our daily lives. I mean, we say barbecue, from barbacoa, hammock, from hamaca, tobacco, canoe.
We're speaking Taino every single day and don't even realize it.
Yeah.
And the name of the island itself, Jamaica, land of wood and water. That name survived all the Spanish renaming attempts. It survived the British anglicization. It's a form of linguistic resistance. The land itself kept its true name.
But then the timeline it hits a brick wall. May 3rd, 1494. Christopher Columbus sails into what we now call St. Anne's Bay.
He called it Santa Gloria. And you really have to understand Columbus's headspace at this point. He's desperate.
Right. This wasn't his first rodeo.
No, and his previous voyages haven't yielded the mountains of gold that he promised Ferdinand and Isabella. He is under immense pressure to monetize these discoveries. So when he sees the Taino lining the beaches, he doesn't see a sovereign people. He sees labor. He sees commodities.
And the Taino, who are operating on their own social code of, reciprocity and hospitality, they just paddle out in their canoes to greet him.
It's one of the most tragic ironies in all of human history. The hello that ended a world.
And it spiraled so quickly. The Spanish established their first settlement, Sevilla en Revenue Seville. And speaking of bad engineering, they built it right next to mangrove swamps.
Which, in the Caribbean, is basically a suicide pact with malaria and yellow fever.
Right.
It was an epidemiological disaster for the Spanish. But for the Taino, the disaster was something else entirely. It was the encomienda system.
This was the legal framework for the genocide, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
The Spanish crown didn't want to technically call it slavery at first, so they created this feudal arrangement. A Spanish settler was entrusted with a specific number of Taino.
Entrusted?
Yes. The settler was supposed to protect them and instruct them in the Catholic faith. In exchange, the Taino owed them their labor.
Protection. That sounds like a mobster's definition of protection. In reality, it was just a death sentence.
It was a death sentence. It was forced labor in gold mines that barely had any gold, and on these huge agricultural estates, the work quota was physically impossible. And then you add the pathogens the Europeans brought, smallpox, influenza. The population collapse is just staggering.
What are the numbers on that?
Well, estimates vary wildly, but we think there were somewhere between 60,000 to perhaps even hundreds of thousands of Taino in Jamaica alone, and millions in the wider Caribbean.
Yeah.
Within 26 years of Columbus's arrival, 85 to 90% of them were gone.
Gone. But this is where we have to nuance that narrative, because gone kind of implies they just faded away. The historical record shows something very different. It shows resistance.
It does. And this is a very hard thing to talk about, but it's essential.
Right.
We see accounts from Spanish chroniclers of mass suicides. We see accounts of women refusing to bear children into slavery. Now, a colonial historian might look at that and write, oh, they were weak, they gave up.
But if you look at it through the lens of the Abeng signal, the lens of agency, it looks completely different.
Completely. It looks like a strike, the ultimate general strike.
If your body is the machine of production for your oppressor,
Then destroying that machine is an act of war. Mothers committing infanticide was this horrific, desperate act of love saving their children from a life of certain torture. Consuming cassava poison in large groups was a collective refusal to submit. They were saying, you can conquer our land, but you cannot harvest us.
and that resistance, in its own tragic way, it forced a shift in Spanish strategy.
It did. The Spanish ran out of labor. And frankly, they also kind of ran out of interest in Jamaica.
Not enough gold.
Not enough gold.
Right.
The big money was in Mexico and Peru. So by 1534, they moved the capital to Santiago de la Vega, what is now Spanish Town, because it was healthier than the swampy north coast. But the island basically became a provisioning station, a backwater.
And this period, from about 1534 to 1655, is what historians call the paradox of neglect.
Yes, because the Spanish Empire was so massive and Jamaica was such a low priority. This neglect allowed the island to go feral in a very interesting way. The economy shifted to ranching, these large ranches called haikos. They just let pigs and cattle run wild in the interior, and they'd hunt them for hides and tallow. It created a very loose, mobile society.
And that looseness is exactly what allowed the seed of the Maroon communities to be planted.
Correct. Because the Spanish didn't have the manpower or the will to police every single acre of the interior, enslaved Africans, who are now being brought in to replace the dying Taino, began to escape. They ran into the mountains.
And who did they find there?
They found the few surviving Taino. They mixed, they intermarried, they learned the terrain, the caves, the water sources, the medicinal plants. If the Spanish had been more vigilant, if the island had been more profitable, they might have crushed these early runaways. But the neglect allowed them to incubate.
So by the time the British show up, there is already a resistance network literally embedded in the geography of the island. Which brings us to 1655, the Western design, or, as I like to think of it, the Great British Blunder.
Chuckles. It really was a farce. Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England, he wants to pick a fight with Catholic Spain. He has this grand Western design to capture the crown jewel of the Spanish Caribbean, Hispaniola, which is now Santo Domingo. He sends this massive fleet under an Admiral Penn and a General Venables.
And these weren't exactly elite troops, were they?
Oh, far from it. It was a ragtag army, a collection of royalist prisoners, indentured servants, people just impressed off the streets of Barbados. They land in Santo Domingo and they get absolutely humiliated by the Spanish defenses.
It's a total failure.
A total failure. They're beaten back to their ships. They're dying of dysentery and heat stroke. So you've got Penn and Venables sitting on their ships, absolutely terrified. They cannot go back to Cromwell empty-handed.
You have their heads.
Literally. So they look at the map and they see Jamaica. They know it's lightly defended. They know the Spanish are barely hanging on there. And they just decide to take it as a consolation prize. Well, we can't get the big prize, so let's just grab the little one to save face.
It's just amazing to think that the entire course of Jamaican history turned on a face-saving measure by two incompetent commanders.
It is. And that accidental invasion triggers this really chaotic transition. The Spanish governor, a man named Don Cristobal Arnaldo de Asasi, he realizes he can't win a pitched battle. So he retreats to the north coast. But before he goes, he does something that changes Jamaica forever.
He frees the enslaved Africans.
He frees them, he hands them weapons, and he says, go fight the English. He essentially creates a proxy army. He assumes that since the Africans hate the English just as much, they'll fight for Spain. And they do, for a while. This is where we first meet Juan de Bolas.
Juan de Bolas. Now, he is a figure who gets a lot of hate in some of the history books, but I think his situation is, well, it's incredibly complex.
He is the first major Maroon leader that we can actually name. He led this group of fighters known as the Lubalo. They operated out of the Luitas Vale area. And for 5 years, from 1655 to 1660, they made life an absolute hell for the British. They ambushed patrols, they burned crops, and they just vanished back into the limestone. The British were dying like flies from disease and this new guerrilla warfare.
But then comes 1660, The Spanish are clearly losing. They're already retreating to Cuba. And Juan de Bolas is left with a choice.
It's a classic game theory dilemma. If he keeps fighting for the Spanish, he's fighting for a ghost. Sooner or later, the British are going to bring in enough reinforcements and wipe him and his people out. But the British make him an offer.
Right. They say, switch sides.
Switch sides.
Yeah.
We will give you and your people land. We will give you the title of colonel. And most importantly, we will recognize your freedom in law.
So he takes the deal. And historically, he gets branded as a traitor because part of that deal was that he had to hunt down other Maroons who refused to surrender.
It's what you call the moral complexity of survival. The Bolas prioritized the survival of his specific group over some abstract idea of racial solidarity, which, is a modern concept that didn't really exist in the same way in the 17th century.
He secured the first legal recognition of freedom for Black people in the British Caribbean.
He did, but the cost was incredibly high. He was eventually killed in an ambush by his own former allies, the Maroons, who refused to surrender to the British.
And those who refused to surrender, they moved deeper into the mountains. They became the Windward Maroons, and they found a leader who makes Juan de Bolas look like a middle manager. They found Nanny
of the Maroons. Now, we are stepping into the realm of legend, but the historical reality is just as potent, if not more so. Nanny wasn't just a military leader. She was an Obeah woman, a spiritual leader.
A priestess,
a strategist. Her power was holistic. And we have to talk about her headquarters, Nanny Town. Strategically, it was a masterpiece of defensive engineering.
Where was it located?
High up in the Blue Mountains, on the edge of a 900-foot precipice.
Yeah.
The only way you could get up there was along this very narrow path along the ridge.
A perfect kill box.
A perfect kill box. Nanny's warriors would camouflage themselves. Literally dressing as a bush. And they would just wait. And you have to picture the British soldiers in their bright red coats, hauling these heavy muskets, sweating in the tropical heat, coming up this path, single file.
And then
the Abeng would blow, and the bush would come alive with fire. The British were just decimated. They couldn't see their enemy. They were fighting the jungle itself.
This is where we get the famous story of Nanny catching bullets.
Right. The oral tradition says she could catch British bullets, sometimes in her hands, sometimes in her buttocks, and spit them back at the soldiers.
Which sounds like superhero fiction. But let's analyze the function of that story. What does it do?
It's psychological warfare of the highest order. If you are a Maroon warrior and you genuinely believe your leader is impervious to British technology, you become fearless. You charge with absolute confidence.
And the reverse is true for the British.
Of course. If you're a British conscript and you hear these rumors that the enemy is led by a witch who literally eats bullets for breakfast, you are terrified before you even fire a single shot. The myth was the weapon.
But this war of attrition, it eventually wore both sides down. The British couldn't win. They couldn't conquer the mountains. But the Maroons were starving. They couldn't farm because they were constantly on the run from British patrols.
Which brings us to the Treaty of 1739. Cudjoe, who was a leader of the Leeward Maroons and a contemporary of Nanny's, he signs a peace treaty with the British.
This is the moment where that Abeng signal gets a bit jammed in a way. The treaty acknowledges Maroon freedom. It grants them land. On paper, that's a huge victory.
Even massive victory.
But then there's the blood clause.
Clause 6 of the treaty. The Maroons agreed to take, kill, suppress, or destroy all rebels, and, crucially, to return all future runaway slaves to the British.
That's just devastating. The champions of freedom essentially become the jailers of the enslaved.
It creates this schism in the Jamaican identity that lasts for centuries. The Maroons remained free, a sovereign people within the island, but they became a distinct class, separate from and often antagonistic to the enslaved population on the plantations.
A classic case of divide and rule.
The British Empire was brilliant at it. They neutralized the Maroon threat, not by defeating them, but by putting them on the payroll, essentially.
So while the Maroons are fortifying the mountains, the British are building something very, very different down on the coast. A city that became a byword for debauchery and unimaginable wealth, Port Royal.
The wickedest city on earth. In the late 1600s, this was the center of the universe for the Brethren of the Coast, the privateers and pirates. It sits at the very end of the Palisado Spit, which is this long finger of sand that protects Kingston Harbor.
The density of this place was just insane. We're talking about 6,500 people living in multi-story brick buildings crammed onto just 50 acres of sand. It was the Manhattan of the Caribbean.
And the wealth was staggering. But it was an economy of plunder. Captain Henry Morgan and his ilk were raiding Spanish cities like Panama and Portobello, stealing gold, silver, religious artifacts, and bringing it all back to Port Royal to spend on booze, gambling, and prostitution.
It was a libertarian nightmare. No laws, just gold. But what people often forget is who was doing the actual work that made it all possible.
Exactly. Behind the swashbuckling pirates were thousands of enslaved Africans and indentured European servants who built the wharves, who serviced the taverns, who maintained the ships. The wickedness wasn't just the drinking, it was the brutal commodification of human beings in a city built on stolen wealth and built on sand.
And then the bill came due, June 7, 1692, a date that's etched into the island's geology.
It was Tuesday. The morning was hot and still. At exactly 11:43 a.m., the tectonic plates shifted. A massive earthquake hit the island. And because Port Royal was built on loose sand and water-saturated gravel, a phenomenon called liquefaction occurred.
Can you explain liquefaction for us? It's a terrifying concept.
It is. When the earth shakes that violently, the water pressure in the soil increases dramatically. The sand grains lose contact with each other. The solid ground you're standing on literally turns into a fluid. It becomes quicksand.
So the buildings didn't just fall over, they sank.
They sank. The eyewitness accounts are the stuff of nightmares. They describe the ground opening up and swallowing people whole. Then the ground would slam shut again, leaving people buried up to their necks, trapped in the street. Multi-story brick houses just slid into the harbor intact. The cemetery slid into the sea, so the dead were literally floating among the dying.
And the tsunami hit.
A huge wall of water swept over what was left of the city. In a matter of minutes, 2/3 of Port Royal was gone. 2,000 people died instantly. Another 3,000 died in the weeks that followed from the stench, the disease, and the lack of clean water.
The preachers at the time obviously had a field day. God has punished Sodom.
They did. But from a historical perspective, the earthquake marked the definitive end of the pirate era and the transition to the plantation era. The survivors fled across the harbor to a small pig-rearing village called Kingston, and the capital of commerce shifted from stealing gold to growing sugar.
This brings us to the sugar machine, the total industrialization of the island.
Once the British realized the Spanish weren't coming back, which was confirmed by the Treaty of Madrid in 1670, they poured enormous amounts of capital into the island. They imported the technology of sugar production, the mills, the boilers, the curing houses. But the most critical component of that machine was the human body.
The demographic shift is just chilling. In 1660, the island was mostly white or mixed race. By 1750, it was overwhelmingly black.
Over 90% black. The Royal Africa Company and independent traders brought hundreds of thousands of Africans to Jamaica. It was a factory. You input human lives, you output Muscovado sugar and rum. The life expectancy of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation upon their arrival from Africa was just 7 to 9 years.
7 to 9 years.
It was cheaper to work someone to death and buy a new person than it was to maintain a workforce through natural reproduction. It was a calculus of death.
So we fast forward through the 18th century, which was a century of just grinding misery, punctuated by huge rebellions like Tacky's War. And we get to the 19th century. The British Parliament eventually passes the Abolition Act in 1833 to take effect in 1834. But this is where the story gets really tricky. We all learn in school, slavery ended in 1834. But did it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not even close. This is the era of apprenticeship. It was a masterclass in political gaslighting and economic cruelty. The British government paid £20 million, which was 40% of the entire national budget at the time, to the slave owners to compensate them for their loss of property.
To the owners, not the enslaved.
The enslaved people got zero.
Worse than zero, they got a bill.
Effectively, yes. They were told, you are now free, but you must continue to work for your former masters for 40.5 hours a week without pay for the next 4 to 6 years. You are apprentices, and you need to learn how to be free.
Learn how to be free. As if freedom is some kind of trade skill you need certification for.
It was just a way to squeeze the last possible drop of value out of them, and because the masters knew their time with this free labor was limited, the brutality actually increased in some places. They wanted to maximize output before full emancipation. And this is where we see the widespread use of the treadmill in the workhouses.
We really need to describe this because the word treadmill sounds so benign to our modern ears. We think of a gym.
This was a torture device, plain and simple. Imagine a giant, wide wooden cylinder with steps on the outside. It's suspended in the air. Prisoners were strapped by their wrists to a bar above it. The cylinder would then be made to rotate. You had to keep stepping, lifting your knees high, just to stay on the device.
And what happened if you missed a step?
The cylinder kept spinning. The heavy wooden steps would just batter your shins and legs. If you collapsed and just hung from your wrists, they would whip you. They put women on this device, sometimes pregnant women. It was designed purely to cause exhaustion and extreme pain, ostensibly as punishment for laziness or insolence.
But the signal got out. The truth about the system was exposed, and it came from an 18-year-old apprentice named James Williams.
James Williams is a hero who deserves to be so much better known. In 1837, he managed to dictate his narrative to a bold English abolitionist named Joseph Sturge. He described the treadmill, the floggings, the absolute corruption of the special magistrates who were supposed to be protecting the apprentices.
And this book was published in London, and it went viral 19th century style.
It completely shattered the lie. The British public, who thought they had paid £20 million to end slavery, suddenly realized they were still paying for systematic torture. The public outrage was so massive that the government was forced to end apprenticeship early. Full freedom finally came on August 1st, 1838, 2 years ahead of schedule, in large part because an 18-year-old boy told the truth.
But before that full freedom, there was one final massive explosion of resistance that really shook the empire to its core. The Baptist War of 1831.
This is the War of Sam Sharp. And to understand Sam Sharp, you have to understand the role of religion on the plantations. The Anglican Church was the church of the masters. It preached obedience. But the Baptist missionaries, they brought a different message. They allowed black deacons to read the Bible for themselves.
And when Sam Sharp read the Bible, he didn't see the verse, "Slaves, obey your masters." He saw, "No man can serve two masters."
Exactly. He developed what we now call a theology of resistance. He preached that slavery was not just a hardship, it was a fundamental sin against God. And therefore, resisting it was a holy duty. He was an incredibly articulate, charismatic leader who organized a secret network across the estates in the parish of St. James.
And his plan was genius in its simplicity. It wasn't originally supposed to be a bloodbath, it was a labor dispute.
It was a general strike. He planned it for after Christmas 1831. The cane is ripe. It has to be cut right now or it rots. He told his followers, "Sit down. Do not cut the cane until the masters agree to pay us wages." It was nonviolent economic sabotage at the most critical point in the production cycle.
But you can't always control a powder keg once you light the fuse.
No, you can't. The planters panicked. The militia mobilized. Some of the enslaved people, maybe out of frustration or maybe they were provoked, set fire to the trash houses at the Kensington estate. A trash house is where they stored the dry cane leaves. It's highly flammable. That fire beacon was seen for miles, and it signaled the start of the war.
The flames of resistance.
The rebellion spread like wildfire across the western parishes. Great houses were burned. It took the British military 5 full weeks to suppress it. And the retribution that followed was horrific. They executed hundreds of people, often without any kind of trial. They put heads on pikes along the main roads as a warning.
And Sam Sharp?
He surrendered, hoping to stop the slaughter of his people. And before he was hanged in the main square of Montego Bay, he uttered the words that I think define the Jamaican spirit. "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery."
That sentiment, it resonated. Because even though the rebellion was crushed militarily, it absolutely won politically.
It terrified the British Parliament. They looked at the cost of the war, the massive loss of property, and the sheer ferocity of the people, and they realized, if we don't end slavery from above, they are going to end it from below, and they will burn the entire island down to do it. Sam Sharp forced their hand. The Abolition Act was passed in Parliament shortly after.
So 1838 comes, full free. The chains are off. But as we move into this post-emancipation era, we start to realize that chains can also be made of paper, of laws, taxes, and land rights.
The confiscation of freedom. The planters were furious about losing their free labor, so they used the legal system to keep the black population subservient and poor. They refused to sell them good land. They passed high taxes on the crops that peasants grew for themselves. They restricted voting rights so that only the wealthy, property-owning class could vote.
So you have this huge population that is free in name, but they are starving and utterly powerless in reality. And this pot just simmers and simmers until it boils over in 1865, the Morant Bay Rebellion.
The context here is absolutely key. It's the 1860s. The American Civil War has cut off food imports to Jamaica. A severe drought has destroyed the local crops. People in the parish of St. Thomas are literally eating roots from the ground to survive. They do what they think they're supposed to do. They petition Queen Victoria. They write this heartfelt letter saying, "Mother, our mother, we are starving."
And the response they get back, The Queen's advice. It has to be one of the most tone-deaf documents in all of colonial history.
It was actually written by the Colonial Office in London, but it was signed in her name, and it essentially said, "The prosperity of the laboring class depends on our own industry and prudence. Work harder."
Let them eat cake, but make it Caribbean style.
It was a profound slap in the face. And a man named Paul Bogle, a deacon in a small village called Stony Gut, he decides enough is enough. He organizes a march to the Morant Bay courthouse, not to burn it initially, but to confront the magistrates who were rigging trials against the poor and handing out unjust sentences.
October 11, 1865, Bogle and hundreds of his followers march into the town square. They are carrying sticks and cutlasses, yes, but they're also marching in formation. It's a protest. It's a demonstration.
The Custis, who is the chief magistrate, he panics. He comes out and reads the riot act. The volunteer militia opens fire on the unarmed crowd. 7 protesters are killed instantly, and that just breaks the dam. The crowd rushes the militia. The courthouse is set on fire. The Custis and several others are killed in the chaos.
Governor Edward John Eyre. He represents the absolute worst of colonial paranoia and brutality. He declares martial law in the parish. But he doesn't just restore order, he unleashes a massacre.
It was state terrorism.
Yeah.
He used the Maroons. And this is a very painful callback to that 1739 treaty. He called them in to help hunt down the so-called rebels. The soldiers burned over 1,000 homes to the ground. They flogged hundreds of men and women with whips made of wire. They executed 439 people, many without any trial at all.
And then Eyre turns his eyes to Kingston, to a man who wasn't even in Morant Bay when it all happened, George William Gordon.
Gordon is such a fascinating and tragic character. He was the son of a white planter and an enslaved woman. He was light-skinned, he was wealthy, he was an elected member of the House of Assembly. He could have just enjoyed his privilege and kept his head down, but he chose to use his voice to champion the cause of the poor. He was a constant and vocal critic of Governor Eyre.
So Eyre saw a perfect opportunity for revenge.
He scapegoated him. He claimed Gordon was the secret mastermind behind Bogle's rebellion, despite there being zero evidence. He had Gordon arrested in Kingston, where there was no martial law, and then illegally transported him by ship to Morant Bay, where there was martial law.
It was a kidnapping.
It was a state-sanctioned kidnapping. They put him through a sham court-martial that lasted a few hours, found him guilty, and they hanged him from the arch of the burned-out courthouse.
They killed him for his ideas.
They killed him because he was a class traitor in their eyes. But Eyre overplayed his hand. The brutality was so extreme, so disproportionate, that when the news reached England, there was a huge uproar. Figures like John Stuart Mill and Charles Darwin, they formed the Jamaica Committee to demand Eyre's prosecution for murder.
So Eyre was recalled in disgrace, but the political fallout for Jamaica itself was massive. The white elite in Jamaica, the planter class, they were so terrified by Bogle's rebellion that they did something unprecedented. They voted to abolish their own parliament.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? They preferred to be ruled directly by London as a crown colony than to risk a future where black people might eventually get the vote and take political power. They surrendered their own local democracy to maintain white supremacy.
So from 1866 on, Jamaica is run directly by a governor appointed by London. We enter these so-called quiet years of the late 19th and early 20th century, but under the surface, the pressure is building again.
It is. The population is growing. People are migrating from the countryside to Kingston looking for work. A new political consciousness is forming, influenced by the great Marcus Garvey, who we definitely need to mention. Garvey was telling black people all over the world to look to Africa, to be proud of their race. He planted these crucial seeds of psychological liberation.
And then the whole economic system crashes, the 1930s. The Great Depression isn't just an American or European thing.
No, it devastated Jamaica. Sugar prices collapsed. The banana production was hit by disease. Wages were stagnant for decades, but the cost of living was rising. People were hungry again. And when people are hungry and hopeless, they lose their fear.
1938, the labor uprisings.
It started at the Frome Sugar Estate in Westmoreland, but it spread like a shockwave to the Kingston waterfront. Dock workers, sanitation workers, factory workers, everyone put down their tools. It was a mass, spontaneous revolt against the colonial economic system. And out of this chaos, 2 figures emerge who would define modern Jamaica.
The cousins. Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley. It really feels like a movie script. 2 cousins with totally different personalities, leading the same nation to freedom.
It does. Alexander Bustamante was the fiery populist. He was tall, he had this wild hair, he was a brilliant orator, he'd lived a very colorful life, he'd been a policeman in Cuba, a dietitian in New York, he went down to the waterfront during the strikes, unbuttoned his shirt, and dared the police, "If you were going to shoot them, you have to shoot me first." The workers absolutely loved him. He founded the BITU, the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union. He represented the power of labor.
And Manly.
Norman Manley was his opposite in many ways. He was the Rhodes Scholar, a brilliant, respected lawyer. He was quiet, intellectual, intense. He looked at the chaos of 1938 and saw the need for political structure. He founded the PNP, the People's National Party. He championed universal adult suffrage. He represented the power of law.
Labor and law. The two hands of the independence movement.
Exactly. They were political rivals, often bitter rivals, but they were pushing the country toward the same goal, self-government. And the British, who were exhausted by World War II and seeing this wind of change blowing across their empire, they began the slow process of decolonization.
So it wasn't a violent war for independence like in Kenya or Algeria. It was a negotiation.
It was what they called constitutional decolonization. It happened step by step. In 1944, universal adult suffrage. For the first time, every adult gets the vote. In 1957, full internal self-government. And then, finally, the crucial decision to leave the short-lived West Indies Federation and go it alone as a sovereign nation.
Which brings us right to the mountaintop, August 6, 1962.
The National Stadium in Kingston is packed to the rafters. Princess Margaret is there representing the Queen. It's close to midnight, the lights in the stadium dim. A deep silence falls over the crowd. A very different kind of silence from the redware silence we started with. This is the silence of anticipation.
The spotlight hits the flagpole.
And slowly, the Union Jack, the flag that had flown over the island since Penn and Venable, since the Treaty of Madrid, since the hangings at Morant Bay, is lowered for the final time. And in its place, the black, green, and gold of Jamaica rises into the night sky.
The sun shineth, the land is green, and the people are strong and creative.
It was a moment of pure euphoria. But, I always want to zoom in on the faces in that crowd. You see the joy, absolutely. But you also see a bit of trepidation, because the Abeng signal had changed its tune once again. It wasn't blowing "war is coming" anymore. It was blowing "now what?"
And that's the so what of this entire deep dive, isn't it? 1962 happened. The British left. But did the systems that they built leave with them?
That is the defining struggle of the entire post-independence era. Sometimes we call it flag independence.
Yeah.
You have the flag, you have the anthem, you have the seat at the UN. But who owns the bauxite mines? Who sets the international price of sugar? Who controls the banks? For a long time, the answer was still foreign entities.
Colonialism 2.0, economic dependence.
Exactly. But while that economic struggle continued, the cultural independence that erupted was ferocious and world-changing.
And this is where we have to talk about Rastafari.
Rastafari is the direct spiritual heir to the Taino Cahoba ceremony, and to Nanny's Obeah, and to Sam Sharp's theology of resistance. It was a root and branch rejection of the British colonial value system. Rasta said, "We are not British subjects. We are Africans in exile." They grew their hair in dreadlocks like the warriors of old. They even created their own language, Ayaric, intentionally disrupting English grammar to empower the speaker, I and I, instead of you and me.
And that culture built a brand new amplifier for the Abeng signal, reggae music.
Think about it. By the 1970s, you could go to a township in Soweto, to a protest in London, to a nightclub in Tokyo, and you would hear Bob Marley singing "Get Up, Stand Up." The drum pattern, the famous one drop, is the heartbeat. The bass line is the heavy dread of history. And the lyrics, they're the same coded messages Nanny was sending through the mountains. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery.
It's the same frequency. From the conch shell on the beach, warning of Columbus, to the cow horn in the cockpit country, to the sound system in a Kingston dance hall.
It is the absolute insistence on human dignity. It is the refusal to be a thing, an object, a piece of property.
So as we wrap up this massive journey, from the pottery shards of the redware people all the way to the independent nation of Jamaica, what is the final takeaway? How should our listener process all of this history?
I think the biggest lesson is about the durability of resistance. Systems of oppression are incredibly powerful. They have armies, they have laws, they have capital, they have inertia on their side. They can crush a rebellion like Morant Bay. They can silence an entire people like the Redware, but they cannot extinguish the signal.
Because the signal isn't a physical thing, it's an idea.
It's the spirit of the people. And if there is one thing this entire 468-year history teaches us, it's that the Jamaican people are masters of reinvention and resistance. When the Tainos were wiped out, the Maroons rose. When the Maroons were neutralized by treaty, the Baptists rose. When the Baptists were crushed after 1831, the labor movement rose. The form changes, but the function always remains.
Independence is not a destination, it is a foundation.
That's it, exactly. 1962 wasn't the end of the book, it was just the end of the chapter titled Colonialism. The next chapter is still being written right now.
Yeah.
And the question for everyone listening, whether you are Jamaican or not, is this. What systems are trying to silence you today? And what signal are you going to send back?
That is a powerful place to land. Keep the signal strong.
Keep it loud.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. It's been a marathon, but a really necessary one.
It's always a pleasure to decode history with you.
And to you, the listener, don't just learn history, listen to it. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.